put out. Anyway, it was just.
Okay.
Highly recommend. It's like
all right.
going down the rabbit hole of Leonard Cohen.
Right. So there's lots of material. I mean, I could say more. I could.
Yeah.
Free speech, civil discourse, the situation on campus. I would have liked to have tied it all together tighter.
Mm-hmm.
Broken culture of academia, UATX as a potential solution. It's all there, but it's just kind of, maybe there's a way of tightening it up.
Yeah. So UATX offers a different understanding of free speech than I think is predominant on most college campuses today. And part of that exists in the obligation to civil discourse. And there's this concept that your obligation to civil discourse is at its highest in the classroom, and it is at the lowest when someone is invading your home. This is why I was surprised when I asked if you thought that this obligation existed in that moment, and you said definitely yes. Do you think there's any ambiguity there?
Well, I think that there is an obligation. I recognize an obligation to maintain a public character, and there might be some situation where you're forced to abandon that public character. So an example would be that your house is invaded. But in this instance, I was driven by the fact that I was very, very angry. So there was no compulsion for me to engage, and I regret it. And so in that sense, I owed something to that duty, that constitutional duty, and that was to avoid any situation in which it was foreseeable that civic discourse was not going to be possible, and that the opposite might emerge.
This commitment to civil discourse, I think, is being abandoned in what you were describing on your campus at ASU. And this idea of civil disobedience and protests that are meant to actively interfere, that those are not civil discourse. So do you think that civil discourse is a means to an end?
I do think it's a means to an end, and free speech as well. And I think the end, or the ends, are things like learning, enlightenment, friendship, discovery, cooperation. Those are what I would call high ideals. They're things that, when you achieve them, and not everyone does, and those that do don't do it every day. When you achieve them, you feel a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction and growth. Mm-hmm. Whereas free speech is some sort of ideal, but I would call it a low ideal. So there's no accomplishment in simply speaking. And there's not much accomplishment in simply being civil. And there are even ways of being civil where you're underneath the surface, you're actually rude and disrespectful. And none of that is to take away from the importance of civil discourse in any way. It's not sufficient. So when I look at the American Academy, the landscape of the American Academy, including also UATX, but starting not at UATX, I see a really broken culture, and that culture is not going. It's not going to be possible to fix that culture by tweaking the regulations regarding free speech. So those questions are important. What do we allow and what don't we allow? How do we distinguish between something that we consider unacceptably racist and something that is a genuine opinion but might offend someone? How do we make those distinctions? It's part of the American character in general, because of the importance of the Constitution here, to approach these kinds of questions in a legal framework. What should the rules be? And that, of course, is very important, but I don't believe it touches the essence of the challenge that we face in this generation. The essence of the challenge we face in this generation is it's a breakdown of the culture that used to support collective conversation and learning and university and higher education in general. And it's not something that can be fixed with either a magic wand or a magic pen that writes regulations. On a much smaller scale, and hopefully as a model for others, because these things through imitation can spread, we have UATX. And what excites me about UATX, in all honesty, is it's not the Constitution. I have nothing against the UATX Constitution, but it's the intangible, the human. It's the people who I respect bringing other people who I also respect, building spontaneously a culture that is enriching for everyone that's a part of it. And once you have that, and once that's settled in place, I think hopefully you don't need to invoke the bureaucracy very often. And only invoking the bureaucracy when something really egregious and rare happens. And you should already know more or less what the bureaucracy is going to do because the culture has indicated that is really offensive and unacceptable. This may annoy people, but it's a genuine opinion. So that's what excites me about UATX. And that's what gives me trepidation about the problem on a larger scale. Mm-hmm. UATX can solve this problem because we're going to let good people in, and not just good, but people who specifically have an interest in learning. The American situation as a whole is intractable and difficult to resolve because the world is not made up of only those people, and civil discourse depends on a certain amount of inbred shame in people who are not like that, to restrain themselves from giving their opinions in different situations and circumstances. Not being rude in public is something that once was enough to constrain us, and it once was enough of a standard to understand who needs to be really removed from the situation because the situation has just become uncontrollable with this person there. I don't think we have the confidence to do that anymore. I don't think we remember what we meant by rude. This is going to be the project for a generation to fix this.
You can see maybe the irony of you using this moment to come out against public rudeness. But also, I guess I think that broadly speaking, you are correct. I think that this idea of the Overton window, right? People whose views are slightly outside the Overton window don't feel so strongly about their right to express that. They're mostly okay with being slightly confined. People whose views are way outside the Overton window are attracted to these cultures of really permissive speech. Do you have any thoughts on how we might control for that?
In other words, avoid attracting people who are looking for an opportunity to say the most extreme and outrageous things.
Sure. Deal
with people based less on a very precise and forensic analysis of what was said and more just on behavior. So if you have a person who is hard to get along with, and this is happening on a wide scale, maybe the problem with this person is not excessive free speech, but just bad behavior. And I understand that someone could consider this very ironic for me to be saying. I don't think my behavior was good, but I'm answering the question about how to deal with this at the university, mm-hmm. how a university should do it. So I think we have to be, all of us, inhabiting a culture, and we have to be loyal to that culture and willing to defend that culture when we all feel that the person is behaving in such a way that it undermines that culture. And the problem is that we lack moral self-confidence, and that culture doesn't exist. It needs to be recreated. And there's going to be contention in the recreation of that culture. But but my overall thought is that we face a cultural and not a legal problem with free speech, and UATX is going to be an important laboratory for different ways of trying to solve it.
Yeah, I agree. I'm sort of two minds about this. The first is that you talk about patterns of behavior. I think that is exactly right in building a culture. And in this instance, I mean, you talked about how a primary part of the evaluation you went through at UATX was just being all the people in your life being asked whether this was normal for you. And I'm skeptical of the democratization, basically, of people saying, I don't like this, and so it is bad.
Yeah, no, it can't be democratized. It can't be put up to a vote, and that's a disaster. And I think that's the situation we're in, where because we all lack moral self-confidence, that is, we don't think we know everything that's right and wrong in the world. We don't think that our value system embodies this. We try to avoid this by saying, well, what's offensive then, since I don't know? What's offensive is what offends people. And so then we survey people. We ask them, does this offend you? And if they say yes, then we label it offensive. And if they say no, then we don't. The problem that this has created, which is, I think, the biggest problem on campus right now, is that by allowing anyone at any time to determine what is offensive, you encourage, you invite an exercise of power. So I will just determine that I'm offended by anything that I don't want to hear. And this can happen at a group level. It can happen at an individual level. And it's not because of the bad character of any particular people. It's because of human nature. If you grant me that right to define anything in the world as offensive, I'll define it the way I want. And then the more of me there are, the more that. So that doesn't work. And when I say we have a cultural problem, I mean exactly the opposite of let's go survey the people and let them take a vote. I mean, we need to have some kind of moral self-confidence that's not subject to vote. And this is why people are so attracted to the legalism of free speech, because that's what the Constitution does with respect to our law. But in this case, what we need is a sensibility, a culture and a sensibility. And it just has to be shared by enough people. So UATX will have this sensibility if 60% of the people overlap on it there, or 70%. And if it doesn't, it really doesn't matter what their constitution says and what the rules say, and it's all just parchment barriers unless you have the culture. And so I'm excited to try to fix that culture, or I'm excited to see what we can come up with in the laboratory of UATX, but I have trepidation about the fixing of that culture on the national level, because it's really deeply rooted, very difficult to change. It changes slowly, and where we are didn't happen overnight. It's the result of decades of ideology pulling people in that direction. So I am very worried.
Mm-hmm.